everybody, and welcome to the first tier list brought to you by A+Space Games. This is something I'm really excited to bring you guys, telling you about what the meta is looking like for this month of September 2018. So buckle in, a lot of stuff to cover. To begin with, let's kind of discuss how this is put together, the different methods used by different tier lists. So to begin with, I am surveying some top players, both those who are in the competitive tournament scene or on the ladder, and combining their opinions on this through a survey and using that for the evaluation. The players for this month are Flash, Lights Out Ace, Kamado, Tony G, Magikarp, and the Overmaster. Next, I want to talk about the idea of power versus popularity. This is a tension that's built into every tier list, and I think that there's good things that you can learn from both of these ideas. So I'm actually doing a two-sided tier list functioning on both of these concepts, both focusing on what you should be playing with the most powerful decks, and then what are the most popular decks, what are you most likely to run into. Couple notes, I did specify that the players should ignore fun, not ignore preference, just focusing on the decks that win the most, also ignoring complexity about decks that are more difficult to play, and that they should balance their impressions of both tournament and ranked play. They're similar enough that I feel like we can mix them without too much of a problem. Now, I'm really happy, of course, that you're watching the video, but I should mention there's a little bit more information in the article that's associated with this, including suggested decks and more details about how the tiers are composed, so be sure to check that out if you haven't already. So let's get into talking about the decks. We're going to start by talking about the powerful decks, which we thought are the most impactful in the metagame. That is Rakano midrange / Valkyries, Canadians, TJP Flyers / midrange, and then the tier 1.5 decks are Big Combray, Removal Pile, Skycrag Aggro, Praxis Tokens, Combray Alessi, Praxis Midrange, and Ikaria Blue. The tier 2 decks are TJP Blitz, Huru Midrange, Feln, Berserk / Scream, Xenon Midrange, TJP Control, Argenport Midrange, Stone Scar Aggro. Tier 3, of course, was Feln Control, JPS Control, Stone Scar Renadins, Elysian Midrange, and finally Tier 4 were the Mask decks, Elysian Tokens / Shimmer Pack, FTP Moment, and Rakano Aggro. So before we move on to talk about the popular decks, let's reflect a little bit on what we learned from this. The first thing is that a lot of the best performing decks are proactive. Even those that are controlling have a proactive plan, having access to Ikaria from the Ikaria Blue or the Removal Pile style deck, so they can actually end the game as opposed to really reactive decks. And not necessarily like aggro decks. Aggro decks can do fantastically, but more just proactive mid-range decks were, I think, the best performing. The other thing that I would note is that Shadow really seemed to suck in this tier list. A lot of people have been noticing this, that they've really fallen off. The only Shadow deck that showed up in the first couple of tiers was the Removal Pile, which really is only splashing Shadow for a couple of cards, so it doesn't really even count. Let's talk about popularity now. The tier 1 decks that came in as the most popular and the most common on the ladder included Kano Midrange, TJP Flyers / midrange. The tier 1.5 decks were Big Combray, Removal Pile, Skycrag Aggro, Ikaria Blue, and Praxis Tokens. The tier 2 decks were Praxis Midrange, Canadians, JPS Control, TJP Control / Ramp, Combray Alessi, Xenon Midrange, and then Feln Berserk Scream and Argenport Midrange. Tier 3 were Elysian Tokens, Elysian Midrange, Stone Scar Aggro, Stone Scar Grenadins, Mask Variants, Feln Control, and Huru Midrange. Tier 4 was TJP Blitz, Rakano Aggro, and FTP Moment. There were a couple of interesting things to learn from this. The two decks that showed up on top of both the popularity and the power level charts was Rakano Midrange / Valkyries and TJP Flyers / midrange. That's really interesting because these are both flying heavy midrange decks, and it might be finally time to really bring in some flying hate like Aerial Battle, Bring Down, or Slime Splitter Slug, at least as part of the market. Now the final thing I want to hit on are the underrated and overrated decks from these results. For the underrated decks. This is a metric of decks that had a higher power level than they had popularity. So these are the decks that sort of showing some maybe inefficiency in the metagame or something that might be undervalued at present. The first deck that met this criteria was the Canaan's deck, which shouldn't be that surprising given the fact that this is a pretty high skill cap deck. It has a lot of power, but it's not easy to play. So this is definitely one that I always recommend people who want to get better and want to diversify their ways to attack the meta, because it's very strong. It does take quite the learning curve, though, to master it. The next is Huru Midrange. This is a much different story. I think that it's partly a result of decks like Valkyries and TJP Flyers, that they're just stronger versions of the same deck in some ways. They do very similar things. So while technically Huru Midrange is better than when it's the amount that it's seeing play, it's just not good enough at finding its own place in the metagame, so it's still rightly seeing not as much play as it could be had it did not have these competitors. Finally, we have TJP Blitz. This is another deck that is known for being quite high skill cap in order to master it. It's a lot of fun. It's hard to master and hard to put together a good list, but this is a good indication that there might be some room for deck building improvements that could lead to good results on the ladder. Now, with every underrated deck, you also would expect that there are going to be some overrated decks. So what were the decks that had a higher level of popularity than they had of power level? These are good decks to probably avoid or maybe try and counter against if you're running up into them. The two that met this category were JPS Control and Elysian Tokens. JPS Control, I think that really the problem is that just people who love this style of deck, they're going to play it no matter what, even if it's not the greatest. So although it's not super popular right now, it's probably seeing more play than it should anyway. Elysian Tokens, it's a very different story. It's more a result of just Praxis Tokens is a lot better right now. Torch is really good. Assembly Line is really good. I mean, I don't have to tell you these things, but it's just a much better deck, I think, at doing more or less the same stuff as Elysian Tokens. So probably better to just opt for that version. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and checking this out, and thank especially to those who helped contribute to the list. I really appreciate it. You can also support the channel and support the website by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Also share your thoughts as well. I'd love to see what you thought about what we came up with over the course of this tier list. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, join the Facebook group, and support us on Patreon if you have the means to do so. Really appreciate everyone tuning in today. Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.